Hey guys, what's up? Excoundrel here, and today we're going to be looking at the basics of rotations in Vainglory. Now, rotations are an interesting concept because it can practically mean a lot of things, but in realistic terms, a rotation is a move on the map that is made with a clear outcome in mind. And that can mean anything: a move to the gold miner to take it, a move to the kraken to take it, a move to the lane to gank it. Again, anything with a clear outcome in mind. So what I'm going to do is go through some pretty common rotations that we see in every stage of the game, and just outline how they happen, how to prevent them, and also how to enact them. Now, rotations often happen in three sections of the game. This is the way I like to split it up: early game, mid game, and late game. So let's take a look at some of the early game rotations to start. Now, in this video, we'll primarily focus on laning rotations, but there are also jungle rotations that we'll go into as well. Anything marked in red will be the enemies for you to consider in each scenario. So this scenario, an enemy, Samuel and Grace, are pushing in to your jungler's side of the map very early on. The obvious rotation for you would be to move out of lane and collapse on them as a unit, 3 versus 2, to get the kills, A, save your jungler, and B, give you a small advantage in the early game. Now, it's not always quite that simple because there are ways to counteract that. For instance, let's pretend you are with the Samuel and Grace this time, and you push this Idris in early on. What this results in is that Idris can't make the rotation to collapse on your jungler and your captain, because he has to make a decision between losing minions in lane and also has to fight you to get the space to move down through the brush. Idris could counteract that by pushing the lane, giving him the space to go down through that brush. Now, what does pushing mean? Well, pushing, simply put, is just getting your minions to push harder than the enemy's minions. And that is by literally just hitting the enemy minions quicker and harder than the enemy can, and essentially pushing the lane up with your minions going towards their turret. And that makes the enemy laner have to consider whether he wants to rotate and lose those minions to turret, including the experience and the gold, or farming those minions to get the gold and leaving his jungler and his captain to their own devices. Let's take a look at another rotation here. This is a 3-man invade. Sometimes you'll see this. All of the enemy team will try and invade you early on. Now, as a laner, you could collapse, but usually it's too late. So one of the best things that you can do is move to the enemy's backs as a rotation, take their backs, and then recall somewhere in their jungle in a safe spot. Meaning that even if your jungler and captain gets killed, you have still denied some gold from the enemy and lessened the blow of the invade. And that's a good early game rotation that you can make. Other early game rotations especially come from individual movements from the jungler, so the jungler can make early rotations to lane to gank the enemy laner. You should be looking for any opportunity that you can as a jungler to gank the laner, to give your team pressure in the lane and get your laner ahead, which is always a good thing. Obviously, captains, you always have to make sure that you keep good vision control of the enemy brush to sort of prevent those kind of moves happening. Other rotations that the junglers can make, and you'll see this a lot with Samuels and CP Kestrels, is early rotations to the lane to siege the enemy turret. And when I say siege the enemy turret, I mean it like sieging a castle. You're just looking to put pressure on it and destroy it from range where you can. And this will force the enemy jungler to rotate upwards. And the best way to defend your turret is by having your team defend it as a unit, and that involves rotating from the jungle as the enemy jungler, or as you having to defend your own turret rotating from the jungle. Mid-game rotations are all centered really around objectives, less about individual movements and more about team movements, capitalizing on picks or capitalizing on team fight wins. You know, for instance, you're sieging the enemy tier 1 turret. You know, you're going to then put pressure onto it, you get a kill onto the sky, you're going to force Idris to back. You're going to take the turret as a priority. Now, that would be your priority in this situation, but if you have time, and often you do, you can then rotate as a unit and very quickly take the gold miner. This is a team rotation around objectives, giving you a net advantage in terms of gold and map pressure. A lot of other sort of rotations you can make can be centered around gold miner, so you can see that your lane is pushing in. Idris is kind of pinned to his tier 2 turret farming. If you're very, very quick at doing so, you know, for instance, if you've got a weapon power duel, you can just very quickly take the gold miner without the enemy being able to respond because they are so busy dealing with that pushing lane. That's a quick rotation to make as a team. And like I said, a lot of rotations will take place after team fights. And after you've won a team fight, your team has to get something from it. This is what I always say about team fight wins. There should always be something that you're looking to do on the map when you've won a team fight. In my opinion, priority would be turrets. So number one priority is turrets. If you can get a turret after winning a team fight, absolutely do it 100% of the time. My second priority would be a gold miner that is at least half full. That means you're going to get a good payout for your team. It gets you a large amount of gold. That speaks for itself. Gold is good, right? The third priority would be at least getting the enemy Crystal Sentry. Going into their jungle and clearing the Crystal Sentry after team fights means in the late game, the enemy won't be able to hide near their Crystal Sentry, meaning that if you ever have to push your team fight and chase the enemy into their own jungle, the Crystal Sentry will not be there to defend them, and that could actually just give you the straight up win that wins you the game in a team fight. And finally, if you've done all of that and nothing is on the map, then just take the gold miner, whatever value it is, especially if it's close to Kraken time, 14 minutes plus. Just take the gold mine, get it off the map, and get the gold in your back pockets. These are the kind of objectives that you will rotate around in the mid-game. And this is why I really want to stress to you guys, as a team, mid-game rotations are focused on objectives. You should be focusing on getting net advantages for your team by rotating around them from killing even just one enemy or killing them as a team and winning a team fight. You should always have a goal in mind when you win a team fight in the mid-game. Now, this has been a really simple overview of what rotations are and how to sort of think about them. Late game rotations are way simpler than in a lot of cases. Obviously, there are some more complex tactics, but most of your team rotations will be around Kraken. Getting vision control with your captain around Kraken, making sure the enemy is not doing Kraken, team fighting around Kraken, and obviously rotating with Kraken herself. Now, when you take a team fight and you win, obviously you're faced with two decisions. You either take the Kraken or you win the game, right? Those are the only two decisions I think that you have in the late game. If you take the Kraken, you rotate with her, you get as much work done with her as possible, and then you make sure you back out safely. Your other decision is just straight up win the game, and that can be a hard decision to make as a team. I often have the rule of thumb in my solo queue games that if the choke point turret, which I'll highlight in a second, is still up and the enemy has got around 30-second death timers, it's probably quite hard for you to win the game. And it also depends on your composition and how quickly you take towers. But if you have just those two next Vein Crystal turrets up, then often you can make a very quick rotation from a team fight and win the game outright. And that's something that you'll come with experience, learning when you cannot win the game. Another late game tactic to remember is if the enemy Vein Crystal is exposed, you can straight up backdoor. You can literally run at their exposed Vein Crystal and kill it if you think that you have the speed and the prowess to do that. Again, a lot of this comes with the sort of experience in the late game, but the main two decisions and the main two rotations you ever make in the late game is, do I take Kraken off the back of a team fight win, or do I take the win itself? Obviously, there is the option to take a turret and then take Kraken. That's very fair if there are still lane turrets up, but if anything is past that choke point turret, the one that gains entrance to the enemy base, I would never commit to a Vein Crystal turret instead of a Kraken. I would, if I can't win the game from taking the Vein Crystal turrets. If I can win the great game from taking the Vein Crystal turrets, I absolutely would. But otherwise, I would always focus on Kraken. The only other decision that you have to be aware of, and be aware of for the enemy team, is that backdoor decision. If they try and go straight for your Vein Crystal, you make sure you've got good vision to protect them coming in through lane. Make sure you have good vision to protect them jumping over walls, because remember, wall jumps are possible. And always keep an eye on whether you can make that play, because often that might be the best way of you winning. If you're starting to lose team fights because they're getting to the late game, sometimes that is a necessary tactic to win the game with. Anyway, this has been a brief introduction and talk about rotations, mainly just to explain what they are in case you've heard the word before and not quite sure. Hope you've enjoyed it. I'll see you soon.